We're going to get started here in a second. I'm not going to take up too much time because you're all here to see Ed, not me. But I want to say welcome to Buffalo Street Books. If you've never been here, probably most of you have been here before. But for anyone who hasn't been here, we're a co-op, which means we're community-owned. People like you. Some of you might be owners, subscribers, might just shop here. That's the end of my spiel. We're really excited to have Ed, especially in light of everything that's going on with the book right now and The Economist, which maybe you'll talk about. But anyway, please welcome Ed.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody for coming to see The Economist's favorite historian. It's great to be here in Ithaca, and I was talking to Woody about what I should talk about. And then I think what I'll do is I'll talk just a little bit about what the book is about, and then I'll talk about how I wrote it, because I wrote it pretty much all in Ithaca. And then maybe we can talk about The Economist or just go straight to Q&A. Okay, the book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism, is an attempt to put a specific group of people and a specific set of experiences at the center of this story of U.S. history from the American Revolution to the Civil War. And that group of people whose experiences are, I would argue, the most consequential in U.S. history in that time period, that crucial time period in shaping America, are the enslaved African Americans who are forced to move from their homes in the older states to the newer states of the Cotton South. There are about 1 million of them, but they also leave people behind who are also part of this story. Fathers, mothers, spouses, children, siblings, friends, people who also in their way have their lives forcibly migrated, as it were. And I argue that in the book that not only is this a horrific experience, an experience that's worth studying in its own right, because of what enslaved people endure during this process, but what they endure during that process shapes the world that we live in some very important ways. And there are two sides to that shaping. The first is that, as I argue, the labor that they do and the uses that are made of their bodies in the cotton states are absolutely crucial to the development of modern capitalism as we now live in it today. So they shape the modern world. They drive the process. They're not the only factor, but they're crucial to the process of economic modernization, and in some ways to economic modernity, the way that we think about the modern economic world. Most specifically, what happens in the new states is that they make cotton, and cotton is absolutely crucial to the modern world. In the 19th century, it occupies a very similar, not precisely the same, but in some ways very similar role to what oil occupies in our present day economy. Cotton is the most widely traded commodity of the 19th century global economy. And it's absolutely essential, and it's the most widely traded commodity because it's the raw material of industrialization. From about 8000 BC to 1800 AD, most people live in societies that are predominantly agricultural. And in those societies, technology evolves very, very slowly. The way that people make food and cloth and the way that they get fuel changes very, very slowly, when it changes at all. Populations grow and populations collapse. Human beings, to a large extent, are still in a sort of natural cycle, a natural population cycle, a Malthusian cycle, some would call it. After some point in the 1700s, there is the right combination of technology and resources and ideas to drive some societies into a new way of doing things economically, a way in which growth begins to hit a new curve that will allow populations to expand rapidly, even as standards of living are expanding rapidly. And one of the most crucial aspects of this is that human beings are able to start producing things in new ways that are more efficient, so that more product is being made per hour of labor by an individual laborer. Traditionally, what we've seen as the core, the center of that process, and we all live in a world that's shaped by those kinds of changes, is the industrial factory system. We've seen that as the center of that process because with the invention of new machines, people's labor is multiplied by the machines themselves. And this has effects that go into the way we consume things and go into the way that we produce the food that we eat and so on and so forth. And we're all living still in the middle of that process of that constant change, that constant revolution in how we produce and how we make things. But the core of that change, the place where it starts, the place that Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote about, the place that William Blake was already referring to, the place that shaped the way Charles Dickens sees the world, the place where those changes were generated was the cotton textile factory, the textile factories of northern England in particular, although that then spreads into Western Europe and to the northeastern United States. And these factories spun cotton, and then they wove cotton into textiles, into cloth that was sent around the world and broke open markets all over the world, displaced traditional ways of making cloth, convinced people that they should do things that were very different from what they did before. They convinced the availability of cloth and the new kinds of marketing that were applied to selling that cloth, convinced people, for instance, that you really should wear different clothes every day. You should have a different outfit for every day of the week. This was not really possible in a world where your options were primarily wool and linen that were woven by the local weaver and so on. Well, for years we've seen that process as something that's totally different from the world of the antebellum South and from the cotton fields. And this has been sort of strange because it's cotton, that is grown in those fields that is spun and woven into cloth in those other places. And in fact, when you look closely at the process between 1790 and 1860, as cotton textiles take over world markets and as they become the starting process of a much bigger series of economic changes, other industries that spin out of the cotton industry, the price of cotton drops to 15% in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms of what it had been in 1790. So even as demand increases, the price is dropping because supply is increasing even more quickly. And the reason it's increasing so quickly is because it's being made more and more efficiently, more and more productively, more and more rapidly in the cotton fields to which 1 million people are being moved, separated from their families, from Maryland and from the Carolinas, even a few like Solomon Northup, kidnapped from New York. So what happens in those cotton fields to push the price of cotton down to 15% of what it had been, to help to make possible all of these tremendous changes? And again, it's not the only thing that happens to make these changes possible, but it's an absolutely crucial factor. Well, what I found in doing my research, and what I think increasingly other historians will perhaps be talking about, is that slave owners used a very careful process of measurement and labor management. And again, if you saw 12 Years a Slave, you get actually a very good glimpse of that, and probably a better account of it than most historians had given before the movie came out. Every day, an enslaved person's cotton picking was weighed at the end of the day, and the amount was written down on what's essentially a giant spreadsheet, a ledger book with columns for the day and rows for the individual enslaved person. And it was compared, what they picked on a Tuesday was compared to what they had picked on a Monday. And in fact, we know from the accounts of former slaves, and those accounts are really more than anything else, along with these sorts of ledgers, one of the key bases of my book. We know from these accounts that those who didn't match their quota, the quota that had been assigned by an enslaver based on what they had picked before, those who didn't match their quota would be whipped. And sometimes it's a very specific process of accounting. You were 8 pounds short, you owe me a debt of 8 lashes. I'm going to whip you with 8 lashes. And these were not light spankings, these were blood-drawing bullwhip cuts. So enslaved people figured out a way to pick their quota. And then the slave owner raised the quota. And this happened again and again. So that from 1800 to 1860, the amount of cotton that individual enslaved people pick on average rises 400%, 4 times over. 4 times over. And it's possible that improved seeds and soil and so on plays a role in that, but people still had to pick all that cotton. And we know from hints and sometimes explicit descriptions that the way they pick is different in 1860 compared to what they did in 1800. There's a massive process of creativity, of learning, of teaching each other, of finding a way to get that cotton picked. Every day, all day, people were trying to figure out a way to get the cotton picked. And so this is responsible for bringing down the price of cotton, for pushing the Industrial Revolution forward, for shaping the world that we live in today in all sorts of ways. And the basis of it is this process of creativity in the cotton field that is completely stolen and driven by torture, I argue in the book. It's a powerful thing, I think, for us to all reckon with, because it is at the foundation of the world that we live in. And that's one half of the story. And I talk about the political consequences of that. I talk about the way in which enslaved people were literally financialized at 20% of the value of all the wealth in the American economy. They were a really useful source of collateral for people to write loans on, for people to issue bonds on. And so enslaved people in this sort of paper form, right, circulate around the financial circuits of the world. So they're living and they're working, but they are at first or second hand being traded around by whites who may not even, have ever seen them ever even set foot in a slaveholding state, but they are still making financial bets on the value of those enslaved people. And so that means that the whole Western world is implicated to some extent in the slavery that has developed by 1860 because of the value of the cotton and because of the value of enslaved people as collateral and the truly, in some ways, innovative, and we think innovation is good, right? We've been taught to think of innovation as always good, but these processes were innovative as well. And that innovation enables more and more people to draw profit from the torture of enslaved people. That's one half of the story. The other half of the story is what enslaved people did. And that also runs through the book. Because at every point where enslavers were able to turn people's bodies and their wills against their own best interests, to literally pit right hand against left hand in some cases, to chain people's arms so that you could make their feet walk from Maryland to Alabama, even though they didn't want to. The people who possessed those feet did not really want to do that. Enslavers were very good at that. But enslaved people also found ways to reclaim their bodies, their minds, their society over and against what enslavers were doing to them. And so it's also in this time period where African American culture, to a large extent, is created. Instead of having multiple groups of people with local cultures, and it's not that local cultures disappear, but multiple groups of people, in some cases speaking different dialects in South Carolina, in the Dutch slaveholdings of the New Netherlands, in Virginia. People from all of those places are brought together in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, and they create a new dialect, a new culture that is, to some extent, made up of all that is merged together, including their own African heritage, but is also created by a commentary, a continual commentary on what they see, on what they experience. And that, in the book, comes together as a massive critique of slaveholding society, which in the minds of a few people who are able to escape to the North becomes crucial in turn to the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement is very small, but it's also very troubling to the deals and the compromises that knit together the American political system by the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And ultimately, the pressure of that movement, black and white Northerners bringing in and drawing upon the experiences of people who actually survived slavery in the Deep South, this brings about the situation in which enslavers find themselves by the 1850s. They want to expand slavery, but the pressure that's exerted on the political system in the North by abolitionists means that most white northern politicians can no longer agree to let Southerners expand slavery and still get reelected. And so this pushes slaveholders to secede. The Civil War happens, and slavery is brought to an end to no small extent due to the efforts of enslaved people freeing themselves in the Civil War. That is the story. I promise there's more to it, so if you buy the book, you'll get the details. But that's the core of the story, and I hope by describing it that way you can see why I wanted to put this where it really is, which is at the center of American history, and why I wanted to take the words of formerly enslaved people and make sure that in my book they were at the center of that book. And in particular, what older formerly enslaved people remembered in the 1930s when they talked to the interviewers of the WPA, a New Deal agency, and also the words of people like Frederick Douglass or Charles Ball, Harriet Jacobs, others who escaped slavery during the pre-Civil War era, and they left their autobiographies and memoirs, and in fact those were absolutely crucial to the abolitionist movement I was talking about. Those things, those texts, those sources are at the center of this story. Although I also found that enslavers are revealed quite a lot in their own papers, especially once you started to read them with the lens that what formerly enslaved people left behind tells us, or what those tools tell us to look for, I should say. So let me say one or two things about how I wrote the book, and then we could probably do some Q&A. So I knew I wanted to write this book from the time I read the interview with Lorenzo Ivey that opens the book. And Lorenzo Ivey was a man who was born in 1850 to enslaved parents in Danville, Virginia. And he was interviewed by a master's student from Hampton University who was working for the WPA. And so, this is in some ways it's a revelatory interview because the interviews where formerly enslaved people were interviewed by other African Americans, the information that's recorded is much more clearly anti-slavery. It's much more clearly willing to say, it's not just that some enslavers were bad, mine was bad, right? The ones who were interviewed by whites often found that they had to do a little dance in order to get their story into a wider telling, let's put it that way. But Lorenzo Ivey was very reflective, and he found he still had some educating to do even for an African-American master's student who was interviewing him. And he, I think, shocked the young man who was interviewing him by essentially telling him the half has never been told, which is where I get the title from. Slavery, he explained, was actually much worse than you understand. And it was much bigger than you understand, and it moved. I saw, he said, people coming by the hundred over the hills on their way from the eastern part of Virginia through the ridges of the Piedmont where Danville is towards the deep south, in chains with everything they had, their little all, he put it, in a sack on their backs. And once I read that, I knew I had to tell this story. I had to do my best to do that. And I was able to spend a year based primarily in my hometown of Durham, North Carolina, looking at the huge numbers of planter-generated documents at UNC and at Duke, these massive archives. And what I found was that this process of the expansion of slavery and the expansion of cotton production touched everything in the story of U.S. history up to 1860. Everything from party politics to banks to the clothes that people wore in places of the parts of the world 1,000 miles away or even further from the South. But I didn't know how to fit it all together until one night I was in Ithaca and I had been sanding my floor and I was really tired, but I had to get out of the house. So I took a shower, got dressed, and I went down to Madeline's. And I sat at the bar, and I started to think about this problem of how do I tell this story so that it moves forward like a story, where things that happen in 1790 lead to things that happen in 1804, lead to things that happen in 1819, and so on. But also where it explores the different ways in which all of the things that are happening in the United States are, to a large extent, driven by what's happening in the cotton fields, on how people are surviving, on how they're being exploited at the same time. Because that second thing would lead to a sort of more topical story in which I'll talk about the domestic slave trade here, and I'll talk about African American religion here, and I'll talk about the cotton fields there. And it's hard to see how that would link up as a chronological story. And I started to think about an essay that Ralph Ellison wrote. It was just one of those moments where things click into place. And he wrote an essay where, this was in the 1950s, you probably know Invisible Man, which I think is the great novel, the great American novel of the 20th century. But he wrote this essay in which he said, using the terminology of the 1950s, the story of American history is really best represented as a drama enacted on the body of a Negro giant, trussed up like Gulliver, tied down, able to influence the action some, but also the subject of of much of the action at the same time, the basis of everything that's happening, and yet perhaps ignored by some of the people who are on top of the body, as it were, but still the basis. And I thought, well, what if we put that body in motion? And so I ended up scribbling a bunch of stuff on a napkin, which I still have in a folder somewhere. And I decided that the thing to do was to write a book in which the chapters were named after the body parts of a giant put into motion, spread out, forced to become the basis of American history, American development, but also with a will of its own. And in fact, I came to see that, in fact, part of what's happening is the body is getting formed as enslaved African Americans move from being individuals or family members or members of local cultures to a much bigger kind of solidarity, much bigger kind of identity. And so eventually I began to think this is really the story of two bodies. This is the story of the body that slave owners see and the ways that they exploit it, but it's also the body that people reclaim and that they in fact construct. So, if it's a good book, Madeline's get some credit. If it's a bad book, they get the blame. But the origin of the structure is on that napkin from long ago. I don't know if I should say anything else. I know that I have to thank The Economist for giving me lots of great publicity. If some of you have been lucky enough to not keep up with that, I can explain that too. But I think I'll stop and I'll take questions, and just thanks again for coming. Yeah.
Probably you already looked at some of the post-1865 periods. There was this big decline in our exports of cotton.
Mm-hmm.
That meant that there was a development of cotton production elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
People who were slaves, and then they reflect on how things are different for them in that Reconstruction period. I'd be interested in what people said in whatever journals they were keeping.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know about how cotton was made after the Civil War. But, of course, the South slave-owning leaders are very confident before the Civil War that the fact that they're in this position, like which maybe is analogous to that of Saudi Arabia plus Kuwait plus Iran plus Nigeria in terms of their share of the world market. I mean, they own 80% of what gets sold in Liverpool, which is the world's big cotton market. Liverpool cotton market, in fact, is where the concept of supply and demand is identified, right? Because it's such a huge market. It's such a great thing to study. But that's in the 1870s or 80s. But they're so confident. Of course, James Henry Hammond, this South Carolina senator, says, "No power on earth dares make war on cotton. Cotton is king." And they assume they can get Britain into the war on the southern side. And in fact, when the war starts, the Southerners essentially make a big agreement among themselves not to export cotton. And Britain has had this anticipation that there will be what they call a cotton famine And they refer to this era as the era of the cotton famine later too. And so they've tried to launch cotton growing efforts in Egypt and in India. The ones in India really do not succeed in producing a lot of export cotton. But the ones in Egypt, which to no small extent are actually involve slavery in the 1860s, enslaved people who were brought down the Nile River from Sudan. These replace some of the production, but they haven't, they don't have enough room. They haven't built up the capacity yet, and so they only replace somewhere between 20 and 50% of the capacity. And so there are these moments where there's a lot of pressure inside the British ruling class to jump in on the sides of the Southerners in the war, or at least try to intervene to bring a negotiated peace. And one of the weirdest things in history happens, one of those very strange things, which is that associations of workers in Manchester, in London, in places that are hard hit by the cotton famine, actually protest against the British conservatives who want to bring Britain in to influence the war. So they choose to take sides with anti-slavery rather than with the slavery that is providing at least some part of their bread and butter. It's not an easy thing to explain if you think people are only driven by economic interest. Economic interest is obviously very important, but at that moment they choose something else. I mean, we could talk more about post-war cotton production, but I think the story is that efficiency per laborer stops increasing and in fact probably decreases without the whip, without the weights, without the ledger books to measure individual cotton picking. People choose a more humane sort of pace. Yeah, in the back.
I heard an article last night, alternative radio, about the fact that until early 1700s, that the existence of a race wasn't true. There was no white race, there was no black race, and the fact that the growth of slavery, in order to keep people enslaved, forced the capitalists to use that as a fear tactic and maintain their control. Did you find any of that in your research?
There's a lot of great work done by historians on the 1600s in Virginia in particular, and some other places as well. But it argues pretty much what you're saying, which is that the concept of race doesn't exist as a sort of clear concept. Certainly when English settlers come to Virginia, they think the Native Americans are very different. They think the Africans who are brought in, who are already being enslaved in Portuguese Brazil and so on, that they're different, but they don't have a sort of global concept of race that says there are these unalterable differences, that it makes some people superior and some people inferior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is, I believe that the sources suggest the institution of slavery is imported pretty quickly from the rest of the European Atlantic world, but then they have to justify it. And so they build up this concept of race bit by bit over the 1600s, step by step, to do what I think maybe you're suggesting or hinting at, which is to ensure that those whites in particular who aren't really benefiting so much materially from the system, so the ones who don't own 20 slaves maybe don't even own one slave, to ensure that they don't make common cause with enslaved people against the people who run the society and who take most of the benefit from slavery. So they give what W.B. Du Bois called a psychological wage to those individuals. And what you see in the 1800s is that as the system of slavery expands, that has to be, that bargain, right, has to be shored up. New kinds of psychological wages have to be created. And one in particular, one way that they do this in particular is they democratize violence. The new southern states democratize violence, allowing much bigger groups of whites to get away with much broader kinds of violence, even against each other. So they stop punishing what are seen as poor white people's violent crimes, fights in the street, bar fights essentially. They stop punishing them differently from the way that they punish duels, which are, much more of an upper class crime, right? they essentially start to let all of those things go, right? So, and we could talk about the ways in which, the so-called Jacksonian revolution in politics, where you create a broad Democratic Party politics, that also in its own way represents an extension of the psychological wage concept, which binds whites who maybe aren't benefiting so directly economically from slavery into a position where they say, no, I don't want slavery to end. It gets me all of these other things. Yeah.
Just talking with these two young ladies a couple of nights ago, in fact, about our moment in history before the cotton gin, when whites could not have anticipated what you're talking about happening in the 19th century. And how between the Declaration of Independence and the writing of the Constitution, the best arguments about the philosophies of what man meant about race. Of course, women still weren't at the table, but there were some intense conversations about the rights of man in Thomas Jefferson's words. So there was a moment in time where all of the pain that Africans and African Americans experienced could have been avoided. I wonder how deeply your research led you into that space. Another comment question about now what happens in the 19th century. I really don't think people have a grasp of what you're saying, even though if the words are coming out of your mouth. I've had many conversations with extremely sympathetic majority people, extremely intelligent majority people who just fail to grasp that as a country we have never had a percentage of our economy based on one thing the way we do that. And we've never made as a percentage as much profit from it. Last piece. I also understand that our collateralized debt obligations that led us astray in the recent financial collapse were modeled explicitly on the aggregation of the mortgage value of slavery right before the Civil War, and how everyone was more interested than they ordinarily would have been, because it wasn't just cotton that they were arguing about. They had their securities tied up in the actual black bodies. And I didn't really understand how Southerners could say with a straight face that the war was not about the black body until I understood how they had pieced these securities and spread them around the globe. So those are my three comments, questions, illuminate.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can illuminate you, because I mean, like the last point, that's in chapter 7. So it took me a while to get there. I had to read a lot of bank papers and so on till I got to that point. But that was one of the things that led me into the book too, was sort of discovering that the same identical thing that was happening with our homes, right? Enslaved people were in the same relationship to the world financial economy. There were mortgages on them. The mortgages were held by banks. The banks issued bonds. The bonds were going to be repaid by repayments on the mortgages. In other words, by the labor of enslaved people. And they sold the bonds in London and Amsterdam and New York. And so when you bought a $1,000 bond, and $1,000 is more or less the price of a first-rate hand in the New Orleans market in a lot of this period, you were really buying a slave. You were buying a piece of paper, sure, but it entitled you to an income flow that was made up of a little fraction of the income flows generated by 1,000 human beings, right? And so in a way, this was even better than buying an enslaved human being, because the bond, the purchasers believed, was not going to die. The bond was not going to run away. I mean, one or two of the enslaved people might run away, and even more might die. But on the whole, you would get your 6% interest. Now, not everybody got their 6% interest. Something very similar happened to what happened in 2008, in 1837 and 1839. And in the end, the process was also very similar. You privatized the gains and you socialized the losses. And the question was whether the bondholders or the taxpayers of the states where the banks issued the bonds were going to eat the losses. And, different banks have worked out differently. But that's exactly what happened. I don't know if they're modeled, if the mortgage bonds that start to really become so important in the 70s and 80s in our own time, if they were modeled explicitly, or if it's just two people discovering, making this discovery at two different places in time that, hey, if I, play around with mortgages this way, I can create this sort of vehicle for profit. And then, you took us back to that moment in the 1780s, and we don't know what would have happened without this kind of conjunction of the cotton gin, what I call, using the words of enslaved people, the pushing system or the whipping machine, which is the process of the weighing and the quota forming and everything, and the market for that cotton. Without those three things, what would have happened to slavery in the U.S.? You had two forces. You had the people who were saying there are some serious problems with this, whether they were religious qualms or whether they were qualms that were driven by the ideals of the revolution. There's certainly a wave of emancipations in Maryland and states in Virginia, and there are states that end up banning slavery. But I do know that enslavers further south were looking very hard to find ways to continue to make profit from slavery, and so maybe the discovery of the cotton, or the invention of the cotton gin, and the invention of this process of labor management, which is at least, I think, equally important, that maybe these aren't just accidents, that maybe these are things that people sought, that they tried to create in order to make sure that they would continue to make profit from slavery. Depends on whether you're in a optimistic or a pessimistic mood about human nature, I guess, which route you think we would have chosen. Yeah.
I have a question if you have thoughts on how this plays in a broader sense. This is sort of on top of what the gentleman talked about, attitudes towards labor today.
Some portion of the cotton that we wear on our bodies is picked by unfree children in Uzbekistan, and that's just a simple fact. There's some cotton probably in this room that comes from there. We don't know, and we certainly as a society haven't done enough to ensure that that's not the case. So that's happening today. But you're also making, I think, another point, which is that slavery is such a powerful, massive structure in American society in the 1800s, and people do so much to justify and defend it and shape the law around it, that it, even after its destruction, it leaves these sort of free radicals floating around in our social and intellectual body, as it were, which are used by certainly by employers throughout our history since 1865. I mean, the concept of substantive due process, which is a legal quasi-constitutional concept that is used by late 19th century employers to essentially shield themselves from all regulation, and in different forms, different sort of morphs of that same concept that's being used today. That comes out of the legal arguments of John C. Calhoun, the constitutional arguments of John C. Calhoun. It's the same argument. Has a different label, but it's the same argument. It draws on the same interpretations of the same amendments of the Constitution. And I argue that in here, and Robin Einhorn, who's a great historian out at Berkeley, argues the same thing as well. So we're all sort of paying the price in different ways for slavery. We're still suffering from slavery. Let me put it that way. We don't all suffer but it's inflicting a cost on us that we might not even recognize. If you're white and you're an employee in the U.S., you have fewer rights than you would have if slavery had never existed, or if its vestiges had been eradicated from the American constitutional body, from the American body politic.
I just want to add a comment to that I think the pushing system has invaded this country, even in professions that before.
Absolutely.
As a physician, I look at it and I see more people per unit time, and I'm not making the equivalency to slavery at all, but the structure of the pushing and the lack of autonomy when someone else is telling you what to do, and you have to do more and more and more and more and more, or else you're not adequate.
Yeah, get in these arguments where they say, well, you can't improve the efficiency of hand labor, of that kind of work. It's not really possible. And those particular economists are starting from a point of dogma, and they're not really. It's pretty hard to get them to actually listen to data on this point. But Frederick Taylor, a great figure in American economic history, is able, at least according to his story, to sort of break down the motions of people who were carrying big chunks of iron ore from one pile to the other pile, and he's able to get them to speed up and make more efficient their work after a couple of days of study, and thus the field of labor management is born. And there's a whole complicated history to that, but many people have studied Frederick Taylor, and he's writing in the 1890s. He's been speculating, as I have talked about this and as other people have found similar phenomena, that maybe Frederick Taylor knew more about cotton plantations than we know he knew. We don't know for sure. Again, it might be just another sort of independent discovery of the same kind of principle. But more and more, we're all subjected increasingly, unless we're at the very top, we're increasingly subjected to those kind of labor requirements. And again, this is, if you're a physician, you're not a slave, right? There's key differences, but the basic there is one basic principle that is still in common between the two, which is that the primary value of economic activity is seen as the production of profit, and that supersedes and justifies everything else. And if I'm not going to sit here and argue that there's a world where profit is irrelevant. I mean, maybe there is. I don't know how to get there, but when that idea runs rampant, when it's not controlled, then you're going to end up with systems of labor management that push people further and further and harder and harder. And I can't prove it, but I believe that idea has its origins between 1800 and 1860, and the growth that's produced by cotton and is produced by that process happening in the cotton fields cannot be unrelated to that idea. Nick.
What does your research suggest about those patterns of resistance, and how did they fare, I guess might be one way of asking, over the course of this 70-year period?
The patterns by which people resist change, and there's a chapter in the book where I talk about the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is probably the one time in history where you see such a transformative reversal, in the bottom rail and the top rail, right, of a society, from the society where the 1% was the most powerful relative to the 99% on Earth, the place with the greatest disproportion in 1791. It becomes a country in 1804 ruled by formerly enslaved people, where you have this really radical concept of citizenship. And there are lots of tragedies that happen after that. But one of the tragedies is that through a whole series of events, this actually opens up the Mississippi Valley for American control rather than French control or Spanish control. And American enslavers are better at putting down rebellions than the French ones were. And there are reasons for that. But they defeat a rebellion in 1811, which is really the last one that has a chance before the 1860s of overthrowing slavery. And it maybe didn't even really have a chance in 1811, but it's, I think, the closest shot. And after that, for the most part, enslaved African Americans learned that they have to be very careful about how they resist slavery. And some people, they can't be that careful, and many of those people end up dead. And I'm not saying they were right. I'm not saying they were wrong. Again, part of the book is one of the things in the book I want to do is memorialize those people too. But by and large, they figure out that they have to do different things. And a lot of the resistance goes underground. It goes into the forming of a new society, into the manufacturing of survival, because without survival, nothing else is possible. And survival is not a given on the cotton frontier by any stretch of the imagination. And it goes into shaping this ideology that I was talking about before, this idea of creating a really fundamental critique of slavery, which is then exported and becomes politically really influential. But then at the end of the book, I tell a little bit of the story. Other people have told it in a much bigger way and probably much better way, but of the greatest slave rebellion in history, which we typically call the Civil War. But that is the greatest slave rebellion in history. It has the most enslaved participants, the biggest number of enslaved people in all likelihood. It's probably tied with the Haitian Revolution for this particular stat. The biggest number actually take up arms against their former enslavers. And they create, through their acts, a concept of citizenship, which becomes the 14th Amendment, which is not possible without enslaved soldiers, formerly enslaved soldiers, that is equally radical with the one that's in the first Haitian Constitution. So that's the arc for resistance. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if you know of anyone who is approaching the development of prisons, both public and now private, in the last 30 years, 30, 40 years, and the use of prison labor as an economic driver, and are starting to pull together that historical story and spin that out as sort of part of what happened, in fact, to replace slavery in the economic engine.
Well, a lot of people are starting to point out that, the one exception to the 13th Amendment, of course, is essentially prison, right? That you can force labor out of people who are in prison. I mean, it's not a repetition of slavery. The prison industrial complex plays a different and much less significant role in the overall U.S. economy. And most of the studies, to my understanding, have found that the claims that the advocates of private prisons, for instance, make, that they're going to save money for the overall state budget, that these things are never true. So, I think the forced labor in prisons is more like this slave labor that people imagined, some people imagined slave labor was actually like. So in other words, it's inefficient for the system as a whole. But that doesn't mean it's not profitable for individuals. And if you have the political clout to get a sweetheart contract, absolutely, it's very profitable to you. If you get the concession to charge people's credit cards and their commissary accounts and however people are paying for phone calls, yeah, that's very profitable. I don't know who's put it all together in one piece. There's a great book that's out, The New Jim Crow, which I've just been reading. We don't have the same kind of historical distance. We're in the middle of it now, which actually makes it more urgent, that we study it. But we're talking about an institution that binds close to 2 million people in the United States. That's 50% of the size of slavery in 1860, right? So it's massive. It has all these other effects on society as a whole.
But you don't know of anybody who's sort of approaching that story from an economic perspective.
I think a lot of people are working on it, and I'm not sure that there's the big book yet. But maybe other people, have things to recommend. Yeah.
From understanding what you said with the book, that perhaps the most dangerous claim that you're making to people coming from the economists is that capitalism requires exploitation in order to get it going. And that what you're documenting is that the system of slavery was a form of exploitation that was required for modern capitalism to exist. And so maybe part of their response is to maintain their dogma, to suggest that, in fact, slavery was not necessary for capitalism. You were saying, the common understanding is that it's inefficient. And, from what I've heard, growing up in the U.S., people say that, slavery would eventually, had the Civil War not happened, slavery would have gone away because of technological advancements and all sorts of other reasons for why slavery was a doomed system already, is what they're saying economically. So it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but the book suggests that, in fact, that it was profitable, it was something that was self-sustaining, and perhaps it required this kind of violent intervention, the Civil War, in order for it to end.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. I think pretty much everything you said is I would agree to. You know that yeah, I think that's the reason for the reaction, because it does hit people at this sort of fundamental foundational point that, you know, capitalism is essentially good, and it has essentially good origins. It's essentially better than what precedes it, etc. And you know, I don't think we can make that claim after we study slavery. Maybe we would have industrialized or modernized in some other way. Maybe we wouldn't have. I don't know. I can't say. That's a counterfactual, right? But I mean, we can look at it from some angles that suggest that, you know, maybe that in fact is the case. It wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had this transition without slavery. And likewise, we can't say that slavery would have ended, right, without the Civil War. So we don't know what would have happened. What I think the story does tell us is that enslavers and their allies, who had so much invested, right, that they were very, very good at finding ways to transition into other ways of making profit, or into ways of enhancing and evolving their current ways of making profit, to cope with changing markets and changing conditions. They needed the political help, the political muscle to set up, to make markets in the ways that they wanted to make markets, but capitalism always needs that. I mean, it's always a political story at base. So I think if they'd been able to control the politics, yeah, they would have been able to keep it going for a very, very long time. Yeah, Dirk.
I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance sitting here listening to you use the phrase enslaved African American. Why are you using that?
Uh-huh.
What would you use as an alternative? If politically you could say whatever you wanted.
Instead of enslaved African American?
Yeah.
Well, that's something I choose to use. And there's not so much pushback on that anymore, but there was a lot of pushback in the 90s when some historians started to use that phrase instead of slave, because enslaved African American is longer and, you know, unwieldy at first, but it also, I think what it says is, here's a person who's part of a community, which is, of course, you know, complex and always evolving and means different things to people, but, you know, this is a person, and here's a status. It's not the status is the person, which slave can sometimes imply to some readers.
But I meant the American law.
Uh-huh.
Even the Dred Scott decision, very close to the Civil War, said
Enslaved, instead African.
we don't have that status. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious about why you're using enslaved citizenship is cognitively dissonant.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, lots of people can be American in my book and not have full legal citizenship. You know, so in other words, I can say that this person is, you know, from my perspective, part of the broader community of Americans, even if the law doesn't recognize them as fully equal. And so that's how I would justify that. I'm getting much more pushback right now from calling plantations slave labor camps, and some people are really unhappy about that. But you know, I feel like I can justify that too. Yeah.
I tell my students, the word servant in the Bible normally refers to a slave. Maybe a quarter of the population in the Middle East were slaves. A quarter of the population in the Roman Empire were slaves. More than a quarter of the population of Athens, the great
Democracy.
intellectual model,
Yeah.
were slaves, and they were worked to death in the same way that slaves were worked to death in Jamaica and many of the Caribbean islands. But in Brazil, it was easier for people to run away. And indeed in Jamaica,
In some parts, yeah.
people ran up into the mountains, and there were dragoons up there surviving on their own, but that was not possible, apparently, in the US.
Yeah, one reason why the U.S. ends up being different from Jamaica, and by the way, the Maroons, they got up in the hills and then they made a deal with the British that they'd send everybody back who came up there after them, trying to run away and join them. So they cut a deal to protect their own freedom, yeah. And they helped to put down the Great Slave Revolts, and they helped to put down the post-slavery rebellion in Morant Bay. They were complicated, right? But nonetheless, Jamaica in the mid-1700s is maybe 10% white, if that, right? If you're white and you survive, your bout with malaria, it's a great place to make a fortune, right? But when it's 10% white, that's a different thing from the U.S. South, where even the states with the highest slave population, it was still about 40 to 45% white. This means you have a whole population of policemen, right? So, the whole South is, like a Ferguson, right? Where you have this group that is continually surveilling and imposing its will with a force of law behind it, with deadly force on another group of people. And it's, they're much more numerous than they are in Jamaica or even most of Brazil. The other thing that's different is, and you especially see this when you look at Brazil, is there's no escape hatch in the U.S. So in Brazil, over the course of history, a set of sort of in-between classes develop because slave owners who have children with enslaved mothers, they're much more likely to free their children, right? And there are also other loopholes in the law which allow people to buy their way out in some cases, and the church gets more involved and so on. That's a whole complicated history, but that doesn't happen in the U.S., and where it starts to happen, it gets shut down. And so that leads slavery to work out very differently. But it also leads African American culture, I think, to be very different because there's a much stronger ethos of solidarity. And part of that is because of specific things people did, and people made the choice to have solidarity, right? But also part of it is because the conditions are a little different. There's no way out, right? So we're going to work together. Well, I feel like I've kept y'all too long, but thank you so much for your questions.